Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking on a giant Gray's Anatomy, Chapter 24, and our goal is to really break down the nervous system's architecture. The text calls it the most complex product of evolution, and it governs everything: consciousness, sensation, movement. So our mission today is to turn these complex diagrams into clear, memorable concepts for you. We're building the system from the center, out.
And to start, you really have to appreciate the basic layout. The whole system is fundamentally split into two main parts. First, you have the command center, the central nervous system, the CNS.
That's the brain and spinal cord.
Exactly. The brain and spinal cord all tucked away safely inside bone. Then the second part is the peripheral nervous system, or PNS.
Which is all the wiring.
That's a perfect way to think of it. It's this huge network of nerves and ganglia, the cables and relay stations that transmit every single piece of information back and forth between the CNS and, well, the rest of the body.
And within those divisions, there are also these specialized control systems, right? I'm thinking of the Autonomic Nervous System, the ANS.
Right. The ANS is what runs in the background, controlling your internal environment. Heart rate, digestion. That's your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems in that famous balancing act.
Fight or flight versus rest and digest.
Precisely. And there's another fascinating piece, a kind of subset of the ANS, which is the Enteric Nervous System, the ENS. This is a massive, almost independent network of neurons that's woven right into the walls of your GI tract.
So the gut really does have a mind of its own.
It kind of does. It can coordinate digestion all by itself, though it's always, in communication with the CNS. Okay, so with that blueprint, let's dig into the CNS itself.
Let's talk about the raw materials. If we were to look inside the CNS, we see two different looking tissues, gray matter and white matter.
Yep. And the distinction is pretty simple. The neuronal cell bodies, the little headquarters where all the processing and synapses happen, they're all grouped together, and that forms the gray matter.
The computational core.
The computational core, exactly. And in the long transmitting cables, the axons, they're bundled together, and they're wrapped in myelin, which is this sort of fatty insulation.
And then insulation makes it look pale.
It does, which is where we get the name white matter. In the CNS, we call these bundles of axons tracts or pathways.
So is this organization, these groupings of cells and cables, is it random, or does function dictate the layout?
Oh, it's absolutely function. Function always dictates location. So small groups of cell bodies in the gray matter that all do a similar job, we call those nuclei. And the tracts, well, they connect specific nuclei to other specific places.
And there's a fundamental rule to that wiring, isn't there? The crossing over.
Yes, decussation. This is so important. Many of the major sensory and motor tracts cross the midline. So control and sensation for one side of your body are generally handled by the opposite side of your brain. It's a critical concept for clinical neurology.
Okay, that rule sets the stage perfectly for the first big CNS component, the spinal cord. It's the main conduit for the trunk and limbs, sitting in the vertebral canal and connecting up to the brain.
Right, and it manages the body through 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now, to picture it, imagine you slice the cord in half and are looking at it end-on. The gray matter is right in the middle.
And it has that very distinctive shape.
It does. It looks like an H or a butterfly, and it's completely surrounded by the white matter tracts going up and down. The points of that H shape were called the horns, and they are functionally very specific.
So walk us through those horns. Where is the information flowing?
Okay, so the dorsal horn, that's the one at the back, is primarily for sensory functions. It's the entry point for incoming sensory data.
And the front one?
The ventral horn at the front is the motor hub. It's packed with the cell bodies of the neurons that send instructions out to your muscles. And then there's a special one, the lateral horn.
And that one's not everywhere, is it?
No, it's only in the thoracic and upper lumbar regions. And it's critical because it holds the cell bodies for the preganglionic sympathetic neurons. It's the origin of your fight or flight response.
So the nerves connect to these horns via roots. The dorsal roots bring sensory information in.
Right, those are the afferent fibers. Their cell bodies were actually located just outside the cord in what's called the dorsal root ganglion, and then the ventral roots carry motor instructions out.
Yeah, afferent fibers.
Exactly. And their cell bodies are right there in the ventral horn of the gray matter. It's a beautifully organized system.
So let's move up rostrally from the spinal cord to the brain itself, which uses 12 pairs of cranial nerves for the head and neck.
And we can organize the brain based on how it develops. So coming up from the spinal cord, the first part you hit is the rhombencephalon, or the hindbrain. This is all about fundamental life support.
What's in there?
It contains the medulla oblongata, which is continuous with the spinal cord, and controls vital things like breathing and heart rate. Then there's the pons, which acts as a bridge connecting to the third part, the cerebellum.
The cerebellum is all about coordination, right? Making our movements smooth.
Absolutely. It's the error correction system. The medulla, the pons, and the next little piece up, the mesencephalon, or midbrain, all together form what we call the brainstem.
And the brainstem is critical.
You damage the brainstem, you threaten life itself. The midbrain is a short segment that handles crucial reflexes for vision and hearing.
Then beyond that, we get to the big one, the prosencephalon, or forebrain.
That's right, which is itself subdivided. You have the massive, wrinkled cerebrum, and then tucked away deep inside is the diencephalon. The cerebrum's surface is the cortex, the gray matter, where all our higher thought happens.
And it's so big it basically hides the diencephalon.
Almost completely. And the diencephalon is home to the thalamus, the grand central station for sensory information, and the hypothalamus, which regulates your body's internal balance.
Now, if we peel back that cortex, underneath is a huge mass of white matter. And there are two really important features embedded in there.
Yes. First, the basal ganglia. These are large nuclei of gray matter deep inside, and they're crucial for selecting and initiating movements.
On a second.
The second is an absolute anatomical bottleneck, the internal capsule. This is a dense, V-shaped band of white matter fibers. And I mean, all the major fibers going to and from the cortex get squeezed through this tiny space.
Which has huge clinical implications.
Massive. A small stroke in the internal capsule can be devastating. It can wipe out motor function or sensation for the entire opposite side of the body because all those tracts are packed in so tightly.
It's an incredibly vulnerable spot. Now, the whole system is floating, right?
Yeah.
In fluid. Let's talk about the ventricles.
Right, the internal plumbing. The ventricles are a series of connected cavities filled with cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. It provides cushioning, buoyancy, waste removal.
And where does this fluid come from?
It's made by specialized tissue called the choroid plexus inside the ventricles. The fluid then follows a very specific path. It starts in the two big lateral ventricles, flows into the narrow third ventricle, then down through the cerebral aqueduct in the midbrain, and into the fourth ventricle at the back before it circulates over the whole brain and spinal cord.
Okay, so we've built the architecture. How do the signals actually travel? Let's start with the ascending sensory pathways.
The key thing to remember here is that it's typically a three-neuron sequence from the receptor in your skin all the way to the cortex. And the crucial difference between the major pathways is where they cross the midline.
Okay, so give us an example.
Let's take pain, temperature, and light touch. The primary sensory fiber enters the spinal cord, synapses pretty much right away, and then the second neuron immediately decussates, it crosses to the other side, and ascends as the spinothalamic tract.
But what about finer sensations, like being able to tell 2 points apart on your skin, or knowing where your limbs are without looking?
That's discriminative touch and proprioception. And this pathway is completely different. The primary fibers enter the spinal cord and ascend on the same side, ipsilaterally, in the dorsal columns.
So they don't cross right away.
They don't cross at all in the spinal cord. They travel all the way up to the medulla, synapse there, and then the second-order neuron's axon decussates in the medulla, forming a new tract called the medial lemniscus.
That's a huge difference. So a spinal cord injury could affect pain and fine touch on opposite sides of the body below the lesion.
Exactly. It's the key to localization. Now let's flip it. Let's look at the output. The descending motor pathways, specifically the corticospinal tract for fine, skilled movements.
All right, trace the path for us.
Fibers originate in the motor cortex. They travel down through that vulnerable internal capsule, and then most of them perform the most famous crossing of all.
The decussation of the pyramids.
The decussation of the pyramids in the ventral medulla. Once they cross, they become the lateral corticospinal tract and head down to the spinal cord to connect with the motor neurons.
And this brings up that really critical clinical distinction you mentioned earlier, upper motor neurons versus lower motor neurons.
Right. LMNs are simple. They are the final common pathway. The motor neuron in the spinal cord that directly plugs into the muscle, damage an LMN, and you get what you'd expect.
Flaccid paralysis, muscle wasting.
Exactly.
Okay.
But if you damage an UMN, that descending corticospinal tract, you get a very different, almost opposite set of signs.
This is the part that always seems so counterintuitive. Why would damaging the control pathway cause increased reflex activity and spasticity?
Because those descending UMN pathways aren't just telling muscles to go, they're also constantly providing inhibition, a sort of regulatory brake on the spinal reflex arcs. When you damage the UMN, you lose that descending inhibition.
So the local reflexes are unleashed.
They're unleashed, they become hyperactive, and that's why you see signs like increased tendon reflexes, hypertonia, or spasticity, and that classic Babinski sign. It tells you the problem is in the central control, not the final wire.
And of course, the corticospinal tract doesn't work alone. You've got the basal ganglia selecting the movements and the cerebellum coordinating them in real time. It's a team effort.
A huge team effort. Now, let's zoom back out to the periphery, the PNS. We've got our 31 pairs of spinal nerves and the 12 pairs of cranial nerves.
And you mentioned a fun fact about one of the cranial nerves.
Oh, right. The olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, for smell. It's unique because it's the only sensory nerve that projects directly to the cerebral cortex without stopping at the thalamus first, a testament to its ancient evolutionary importance.
And when we map these spinal nerves on the body, we use dermatomes and myotomes.
We do. A dermatome is the patch of skin supplied by a single spinal nerve. And what's important to remember is that they overlap a lot. You need to know the key landmark areas where there's less overlap to pinpoint a lesion accurately.
Okay, let's shift to the autonomic nervous system structure. You said its pathway is unique.
It is. It always uses a two-neuron sequence. You have a preganglionic neuron from the CNS that synapses in a peripheral ganglion on a postganglionic neuron, which then goes to the target organ.
And the origins tell the story. The sympathetic system fight or flight comes from the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord.
P1 to L2 or L3 from that lateral horn we talked about. And its preganglionic fibers are generally short. They connect to the sympathetic trunk, that chain of ganglia right next to the vertebral column.
And the parasympathetic, rest and digest.
That's the craniosacral outflow. So it originates from some cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and the sacral part of the cord. And here, the preganglionic fibers are really long. They travel almost all the way to the target organ before they synapse.
Which means the postganglionic fibers are very short, giving it more localized control.
Precisely. Now, one last crucial clinical point. Referred pain.
Ah, yes. When pain from an internal organ is felt somewhere else, like on the skin.
Right. And it happens because the visceral pain fibers travel back to the same spinal cord segments as the somatic pain fibers from the skin. The brain gets confused. It misinterprets the signal from, say, the heart as coming from the chest wall or the arm. That's why cardiac pain from T1 to T5 spinal nerves is felt in the left chest and arm.
It's a diagnostic lifesaver to know those patterns.
Mm.
To wrap up, how do we translate all this internal anatomy to the surface of the body?
We use craniometric landmarks. These are reference points on the skull. For example, we use a line from the nasion, the bridge of your nose, to the inion, that bump at the back of your skull.
And you can use that to find really important structures.
Absolutely. You can approximate the position of the crucial central sulcus, which separates the motor and sensory cortices, by finding the superior Rolandic point, which is about 2 centimeters behind the midpoint of that nasion-inion line. It lets you map the inside from the outside.
So we've covered the whole blueprint. The CNS and PNS, gray and white matter, the H-shaped spinal cord, the 3-part brain, those critical ascending and descending pathways with their different decussation points, and the two-neuron setup of the ANS.
As a final thought, it's worth remembering this system isn't just a passive wiring diagram. The source text mentions that some primary sensory neurons, like in the gut or the heart, actually release transmitters from their peripheral ends. It's a process called peripheral neurogenic inflammation.
So they're acting like output neurons.
In a way, yes. They can cause local effects like vasodilation. It shows that the nervous system is actively, dynamically involved in tissue repair and maintenance far beyond what we're consciously aware of.
A profound reminder that this system is really the operating code for our entire being. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the anatomical basis of the nervous system.
We really hope these descriptions of the CNS, PNS, and the sensory and motor architecture help you organize some of the most challenging material in anatomy.
And thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team.